Greetings, friends, and welcome to another Saturday episode of Countdown to His Coming. We're going to be looking at some news items from around the world that the mainstream media won't be telling you about. And we're going to look at an article from a Jewish writer from Great Britain, of all things, to put in perspective a passage of scripture we're going to read here shortly. Matthew chapter 24, verse 7, which describes a little bit of what the world might look like before Jesus comes. And he mentions a phrase that we've used often in preaching, and it always says the same thing in English. Matthew 24:7, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." And because it's pretty consistent across most English translations, none of us ever question what it might mean, although it sounds like it's just repeating the same thing. Now, this comes from the Olivet Discourse, and again, you do find it there in Matthew 24, verse 7, is one of those statements Jesus made as he's talking about the days ahead before he sets up his kingdom, before his return, his second coming. And to say nation rises against nation and kingdom against kingdom sounds almost like you're repeating the same thing over again. But there's a slight difference that you need to watch, I think, that we see very evident today. In the Greek language, the word nation there is ethnos. And so what Jesus said was ethnos will rise against ethnos. Now you may notice that that Greek word sounds a lot like ethnic, and there's a reason for that. And although it's been translated in the past as nations, typically when that word was originated, that's because those nations all were separate ethnic groups, sometimes in separate areas. They might be a small nation, but they were all one ethnic group. And so what do we have taking place here in the end? We might just have something that's more accurately portrayed in a couple of other translations that you wouldn't normally use. The Worldwide English translation, which by the way is fairly recent, says one tribe will fight against another tribe. It really shows that there's a difference in that Greek word when you're referring to an ethnos. Well, one translation that I want to point to today has an entirely different take on that. The OJB translation, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a little bit, Orthodox Jewish Bible, says, "For there will be an intifada of ethnic group against ethnic group." Do what? An intifada of ethnic group against ethnic group? Yeah. Now, what am I quoting from? The OJB, or the Orthodox Jewish Bible, was completed around 2002. It's an English language version that applies Yiddish and Hasidic cultural expressions to the Messianic Bible. And for that reason, it may bring some insight that in English we've just kind of missed. It's gone over our heads. What are we seeing today in the world? Exactly what Jesus described. Yes, ethnic groups against ethnic groups, and in more distinct terms, is there an intifada of ethnic group against ethnic group? Well, if you look across the world today, you're going to see this expressed in some of the most terrible ways by the cultural clash that's going on, and not just here in America, but all over the world, but it's been going on in Europe for some time. Now, just last week, a woman named Eva with a last name that's so long and unpronounceable, I'm not going to attempt to share what it is. She was speaking at CPAC in Hungary about what's been happening in Europe. She spoke about the open attack on the Judeo-Christian faith in Europe and how society has literally been turned upside down. What has happened? Well, she said, now this again was about a week ago when she made the speech, but she was referring to the previous week, and she said events of the previous week include in Stockholm, where 3 elderly women in their 70s were stabbed in broad daylight. In London, 4 stabbings over about a 42-hour period of time. In Paris, rioting by African immigrants, another church burned to the ground. This is becoming routine in Europe. And there's a cultural, consistent crime wave that now has swept across the continent. She says rape, stabbing, shootings, and even beheadings are becoming more commonplace in what used to be Christian nations of Europe. What happened? Well, one thing happened: mass migration. Not just allowed, but encouraged by certain cultural elites in Europe. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like something that's happening right now in the United States. They've been subject to this, though, for years, and it's completely changed not just their culture, but their population makeup across Europe. She reiterated how if something doesn't change, this will go down in history as when Europe was conquered, not by an invading army, but by invaders who were invited in by a corrupt elite. What are the statistics? Well, in European capitals like Amsterdam and London, migrants in many neighborhoods completely outnumber locals. Matter of fact, locals don't even have any kind of perspective on how they could regain their position in their own country, in their own nations, because they've been convinced that you're not supposed to have children. There's this green new kingdom. We're supposed to respect Mother Earth, not have many kids, or maybe not have kids at all while the immigrants are having children. It's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe to have your nation completely destroyed from within. You see, not by an invading army, but by invaders, invited in by a corrupt elite who are from within now doing what the armies of thousands of years have been unable to do from outside. What's at the center of this? The Marxist critical race theory, in conjunction with strange bedfellows these folks are, to put it together, communities of Islam, that with that particular religious faction driving the narrative, this Marxist theory is able to invade and collapse entire countries. Does it sound familiar? Well, it should sound familiar, because this is happening in the United States, and you might think that people on the other side of the world aren't paying attention to what's going on our campuses. But just this week, the Houthis, of all people, yes, a terrorist organization who in their charter call for the destruction of Israel, America, and the Jews, the Houthis have said to those students that might be expelled from universities in New York City, come on over to Yemen, because in Yemen, we'll educate you. You come on over here and become a part of our culture, and we will take care of you. Are you kidding? John Fetterman stood up and spoke out against that and said that was ludicrous, that was crazy. Why would anyone from this country go to a university sponsored by a terrorist group? Well, you might want to ask why we've got those same terrorist groups on our campuses. And what they are doing is so outlandish, you would think everyone would speak up against it. But yet, no, that's not what's happening. What has been happening this week, in case you've missed it, whereas some people from the squad and a few so-called legislators in America seem to be standing with the protesters and saying, oh, wait a minute, they've got a genuine cause, and oh no, they're okay, and they're just peaceful protesters, while they attack people, injure people, tear down campuses. Yeah, right. If you want to really know what's going on, I want to call your attention to an article you would not have read. It's from the Jewish News Syndicate. This comes out of Great Britain. The title of the article is the Ivory Tower Jihad. And she says, in the appalling scenes on campus, monstrous chickens are now coming home to roost. It's written by Melanie Phillips, and I think you would do well to listen to this. It's a brand new article written just on May the 2nd, and today is May the 4th. So brand new, but you won't hear it on your news media outlet in America. But listen to what she says. The shocking scenes on campus over the past few days are far more significant than mere student demonstrations getting out of hand, with Gaza solidarity encampments having already sprung up on more than 100 U.S. campuses and British campuses now following suit. Islamists and the hard left have turned Western universities into a theater of war against Israel, the Jewish people, and America. At UCLA, a Jewish girl was knocked unconscious by the mob. On the campus of University of California, Berkeley, the founder of Students Supporting Israel was repeatedly punched in the head, with one thug shouting, "Go back to Europe, colonizer." At the Columbia University encampment, the mob called for 10,000 October 7ths and screamed, "Go back to Poland," and "Burn Tel Aviv to the ground." One student who said Zionists don't deserve to live was barred from campus, but then subsequently was spotted in the mob that broke into and barricaded Hamilton Hall. Just as on October 7th, Hamas stormtroopers burst through the defenses of an Israel that was looking the other way, and so their supporters have burst through inadequate Western defenses to turn the Palestinian cause into a beachhead in their war to bring down a West that refuses to acknowledge the threat it faces. I'm so glad that she's recognizing something that I've talked about here for months. The fact that the West is in a war that it doesn't know is happening. The other side has declared that war, keeps attacking us, attacking our military bases, attacking our people, and picking them off one by one, keeps moving troops into our country under the guise of open borders and mass migration, having it funded by Marxists who set up American dummy corporations that are non-profits to help fund all this mess. The invasion continues, and we don't even seem to know that it's happening. Let's get back to her article. She says, apart from a few examples as when New York police tore down a Palestinian flag to restore the Stars and Stripes above City College and disbanded an encampment at Fordham University, with the LA police belatedly doing the same thing at UCLA, America has been signaling surrender to the mob. The police should have been called in immediately to evict these unlawful encampments. Students perpetrating intimidation, incitement, or violence should have been immediately expelled. Instead, Brown and Northwestern University sought to appease the mobs by agreeing to consider their demands for divestment from Israel. Columbia's president even similarly offered to throw the Israeli targets of genocide to the wolves by considering new proposals on divestment and shareholder activism, and launching educational and health programs in Gaza and the West Bank, because the protesters were, in her words, also fighting for an important cause for the rights of Palestinians and against the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. Well, not surprisingly, her gesture of veiled hostility to Israel sent a signal of impunity that resulted in the storming of Hamilton Hall, at which point she finally called in the police. The proxy campus war against Israel and the Jewish people is based on defamatory lies from start to finish. The U.S. and U.K. governments have a moral duty to call out these lies. Instead, they are adding fuel to the fire by parroting the same nonsensical Gaza civilian casualty figures, giving credence to Hamas blood libels about the IDF hitting hospitals, and falsely accusing Israel of stopping humanitarian aid. Matter of fact, I want to stop right there by saying I've watched this daily since October the 7th, and no nation at war with another nation or terror group has ever bent over backwards like Israel to make sure that aid got in to literally feed their enemies. All right, back to the article. All this reinforces, she writes, the hysteria against Israel and the Jews. Yet American and British political leaders have voiced dismay and concern over the tsunami of anti-Semitism convulsing their countries. Next week, U.S. President Joe Biden will actually deliver the keynote address at the Days of Remembrance ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day at the U.S. Capitol, hosted by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The hypocrisy is nauseating. That's what this Jewish writer writes, not me. The hypocrisy is nauseating. Why does she call it hypocrisy? Let's read on. So the enemies of Israel in the West think that they're winning. We've thought as much since October the 7th, when the terrible blow inflicted upon Israel galvanized them into believing that the destruction of Israel and the conquest of the West were now within their grasp. And while events on campus are profoundly shocking, no one who's been paying proper attention to what's been going on in both Israel and the West over the past several decades can be remotely surprised. The genocidal threats against Israel and the psychotic abuse of Jews being chanted by the students in the same language that's been used by the Palestinian Arabs and the wider Muslim world for the better part of a century. Yet instead of acknowledging that Palestinian and Muslim Jew hatred fuels an ongoing war of extermination against Israel, both America and Britain have denied this reality. Instead, they've appeased and emboldened Israel's Palestinian and Iranian attackers. While the United States has provided Israel with the military support to prevent its annihilation, the Biden administration is doing everything it can to cripple Israel's war of self-defense and ensure that it doesn't win against Hamas. The administration has enabled billions in sanctions relief to flow into Tehran's coffers, and is reportedly also working to reverse the one thing that could pave the way for peace in the Middle East, the developing rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, all this has further galvanized those who think October 7th signaled the beginning of the end for both Israel and America. Hamas and the revolutionary left, both of which are set upon the destruction of Israel and the West, are now using each other to bring about those twin heinous agendas. In this, radical Islam is making infernal common cause not just with the revolutionary with the revolutionary left, but with Western progressive universalists who have been undermining the foundations of Western society for decades. Ground zero of the onslaught has been the universities. For decades, Western students have been taught poisonous lies about Israel. Now, according to the National Association of Scholars, between 2001 and 2021, Qatar gave at least $4.7 billion to American universities. These funds support professors whose views align with those of Qatari ruling family, the patrons of Hamas. Now, I gave a complete list of all these nations that have been funding these positions in our universities over the last couple of decades, and it's amazing how this money openly flows into our universities to promote the very causes that will tear down our civilization. Who thinks this is a good idea? Well, apparently the folks that receive the funds and get the commissions off of it are loving it to the nth degree. Back to the article. The Israeli Academia Monitor website reports on a Qatar-funded program produced by a collaboration by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, known as the DHA Institute. The Arab Center is headed by a former member of the Knesset, Azmi Bishara, who sought refuge in Qatar after escaping allegations of spying for another terrorist group, Hezbollah. According to an anti-Jewish professor at Duke University, Rebecca Stein, the program is aimed at remaking the dominant paradigm of Israel studies as it has been configured in the United States and increasingly in Great Britain, with its proud advocacy mandate on behalf of the Israeli state. Instead, Bezert's program turns this paradigm inside out, providing students with a radical alternative. Aren't you excited that this is being promoted on your college campuses and at places like Duke? Give me a break. She goes on to write that more fundamentally still, the shocking scenes on campuses are the outcome of the West's willed educational collapse. The understanding of education as the transmission of a culture to the next generation was junked decades ago in favor of a propaganda narrative of Western oppression. This opened the way for colonization of our curricula by anti-Western ideological causes. The admission of students selected on the basis of identity politics rather than intellectual ability even further reduced educational standards to positively infantile levels. This was illustrated at Columbia when this keffiyeh-clad Johanna King Slutsky, who spoke to the media on behalf of the encampment, was jaw-droppingly channeling Hamas's strategy in Gaza. She stated the university had an obligation to bring in food and water to the illegal encampment, demanding, "Do you want students to die of dehydration or starvation? This is like basic humanitarian aid." Seriously? Students, drop your encampment and go down the street to McDonald's. You're fine. Your pockets are full of money that's been provided for you. They've even provided you the tents, the signs, everything else for these encampments, and now you're going to play the oppression card. Give me a break. Well, that's what's happening, and I could go on with this article with more and more of this, but let me show you how she closes this out. She said, "This gobbledygook is beyond parody. Alas, it's all too typical of what now passes for higher education in America and Britain. Universities, the supposed crucibles of knowledge, intellectual challenge, and open minds, are now in the business of propaganda, dumbing down, and the closing of the mind. They have become the principal vehicles for coercing cultural conformity to hatred of both Israel and the West. In the appalling scenes on campus, a number of monstrous chickens are now coming home to roost." But friends, as we read these scary words, as we hear these horrific accounts of what's going on in our own country, should we be surprised? Not one bit. Because the Bible tells us, if you go back to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, the last kingdom of this world is going to be one that tries to stretch over every other nation and do whatever it can to take control. That's the real issue. Is that worldwide beast, that worldwide kingdom, a conglomeration, a scary, I don't know what to call this because it's not from a treaty, but it's like two groups that seem to be diametrically opposed to each other who have joined together, the Marxist revolutionary left and the Islamic Jihad, all so that they can bring down Western civilization, Israel, and the United States. Wow, it looks eerily similar to the beast that's described in Scripture. But all the more reason for you to share the good news of the gospel while you can with everyone you know, because it points toward an event that's eventually going to stop all this madness, the return of the real king. And the return of King Jesus is what we're looking forward to, something that will finally straighten out the mess that we've made of his world. God bless you. You have a great day in the Lord. Worship with God's people this weekend, and I'll see you again on Monday as we wake up in God's Word.